Okay, continuing on the final practice 1, we're going to now do 6 and 7 in this video, and so this is a nested for loop, and so we have in red is going to be the outer loop, and so that's important to realize that. And then on the inside of this loop is another loop. It's nested. And so with this nested loop, you now have what's called the inner loop. The outer loop, every time the outer loop is executed, the inner loop is executed as many times as it needs to until it's done. So we start with the outer loop, of course, and so int I is initialized to be 1. And then it's tested here. And so 1 is less than or equal to 3. So because of that, it's true, we jump into the loop, and in the loop is another loop. Now, for the outer loop, we're no longer going to be touching this first increment. We're always going to come in the back end from now on. But it's going to take a while to get there. So we're down here in the loop, we're going into the loop, and so here we have another loop. Now j is initialized to be the same as I. So it starts out with 1, because that's what I is. It's now tested, and 1 is less than 4, jumps into the loop, and then it says to print j. Well, j is 1. Now notice that it has a print, not a print ln. So that means after it's done printing j, the insertion point stays on the same line. So whatever is printed next will be printed right after the 1. The next line down says end the inner loop, and then go back to the inner for. So we're going to go back to the inner for loop, for statement, and we're going to go in the back end and increment j. j becomes 2. The next thing we do is, of course, test it, which you always do before you go into the loop. So for now, we're not going to touch this again in this session. And so the j is less than 2 less than 4, so we jump in the loop, we print j again. So j now is 2. And again, since print doesn't have print ln, it stays on the same line, and inner loop, go back to the inner for, and so we increment 3, and then you go and you test, and it is less than 4, so you go back in and print j again. You end, this is the end of the inner loop, go back to j, or I'm sorry, go back to 4, inner 4, increment j, becomes 4. 4, however, now in the test is no longer less than 4, so we jump out of the loop, or kick out of the loop, out of the inner loop. So they go to the next line down. In here is a continuation of the outer loop. So the system says to print ln blank, so it prints a blank, doesn't print anything, but then it hits enter. So now the insertion point is on the next line down in the screen, print screen. The next line down says this is the end of the outer loop. So go back to the outer for, which hopefully that makes sense. You go now to here. So to the last argument. I is going to be incremented, and so then it's got to be tested. And 2 is less than or equal to 3, so we go back into the loop. So now we're going to hit the for loop again. So now that we're coming back into the for loop, we start all over, because we've kicked out of the for loop, so it was completed. So if you have to come back to that for loop, then you start all over with the initialization that takes place. So we have to do this all over again and assign I to j. Well, I is changed now, so we're starting at 2 instead of 1. And so 2 is less than 4, so we go into the loop and we print j, and we're on the next line here, so we're at 2, and then we end the inner loop and go back up to this. So again, we're not going to be touching this, and so 2 gets incremented, or j gets incremented to 3. 3 is less than 4. Jump back into the loop, print j, so we're printing a 3. End the loop is the next line down. Go up here, increment j, and that becomes 4. Now 4 is not less than 4, so therefore we kick out of the loop again and go to the next line below the for loop, which is to print a blank line. So now we're here, is where the insertion point is. After this line, we go to the next line down, and it says to end the outer loop, so go back to the outer 4. So we do that, and we come in, and we increment I, so I is now 3. And so now we go to the test inside, and 3 is less than or equal to 3, so we jump back into the loop. And since we're coming back into the loop, now we have to start this inner for loop all over again by initializing j as being assigned to I, or I being assigned to j. So now we're starting at 3 instead of 2 with j. 3 is less than 4, and so in the test, and so we go into the inner for loop and we print j. Well, j is 3. The next line says end the inner loop, go back to inner 4. Increment j, j becomes 4. Well, the 4 causes this test to be false, so we kick out of the loop and print a blank line, and really then the insertion point's right here. The next line down says to end the outer loop, and so now we're going back up here and we're going to increment I. I becomes 4, and 4 makes this test here false. And so therefore we kick out of the outer loop. So we got to go all the way past the outer loop, and there's nothing here left to do, so really this is done. So up here is what your screen should look like without the arrows. Okay, so let's go to number 7 really quickly, because this is the same kind of an idea. So x is 0, and x is less than 4, and so we go into the loop, and now we're on the inner loop. The inner loop says a is assigned whatever x is, which is 0 plus 2. So a starts at 2. 2 is less than or equal to 8, and of course we're not going to go through this for the rest of this session here. So 8. So now we go into the loop and we increment a, and then we print an x. And so again, remember that we're doing a print, not a println. So the insertion point stays, and the next thing that we'll print will be right after the x. We end the inner loop, so we go back to the inner 4, and we increment a, and then we test it. 4 is less than or equal to 8. Now we're in the loop and we increment it. And then the next line down says to print x. We end the inner loop, go back, increment again, test it. 6 is less than or equal to 8, so we jump into the loop, and we increment a, which is now 7. 7 is printed, or I'm sorry, x is printed again, and the insertion point stays on the line. The next line down says end of inner loop, go back up, increment a, 7, or a becomes 8. 8 is still less than or equal to 8. Go through the loop one more time. We increment a into 9. Now, even though 9 is now would make the test false, we've already passed the test, so we don't go back. We're now going to the next line down. Nothing tells us to stop the loop. We just go to the next line down. Now we're going to print x. The next line down says end of inner loop, go back to inner 4. We increment, and then we test it. Now the test we fail. So now this is failed, test, it's false. We kick out of the inner loop and we go to the next line down. Next line down says to print a blank line, so now the next time we print is going to be on the next line down. The next line down says end of outer loop, go to the outer for statement. And so we increment x and it becomes 1. And then, so again, we're not doing this. So 1 is less than 4, so we jump back into the loop. Okay, so now we have we've jumped into the inner loop again, and we have to initialize. We have to go through the first argument again. So a is equal to x, or is assigned x plus 2. Well, that's now it's going to start at 3. So 3 is less than or equal to 8, and so we jump into the loop and we increment a. And then we print an x, and then we go back to the inner loop for statement, and we increment a, and then we test a, which is still 5 is less than or equal to 8, jump back in the loop, and we increment. Next line down is to print x. Next line down is the end of inner loop, go back to inner for loop statement, and so we increment a again and then test it. 7 is less than or equal to 8, so we go in and we increment a, which is 8. We print x, end of inner loop, go back to for statement, increment a, and so now 9 is less than or equal to 8, so therefore the inner loop is done. And so we kick out of the inner loop and we continue on with the outer loop. Now we print a blank line, so the next time that we print is going to go on this line down here, up here. So the next line down says we're done with the outer loop, so we got to go back to the outer for statement, and so this gets incremented again, the x does, and so now x is 2, and then we test it, 2 is less than 4, and so now we're going to jump inside the loop, outer loop, and inside the outer loop is another loop. Okay, so now that we're here, we're going to reinitialize a. So a is now, x is 2, so a is now starting at 4. 4 is less than 8, we go into the loop, we increment a to become 5, we print x, end of loop, go up to here, increment a again, 6 is less than or equal to 8, jump back into the inner loop, increment a again, and then we print x. And so we printed x, end of loop, now we go back up and we increment a again. 8 is still less than or equal to 8, so we got to go back into the loop, and so the first thing is to increment this, and 9. So now again, nothing tells us to stop. This now a is 9, so we go to the next line down, and that's to print x again. So we're going to print 3 x's once again. End of loop, go back up and increment. So now x is 10, or a is 10, which makes the statement false. So we're kicked out of the inner loop and go to the next line down, which is to print a blank line. So the next time you go through this, this will end up being printing on this line. So we go back up then to the outer for statement and increment x, which is 3. So we can see this is going to be the last time through the loop, because 3 is less than 4. That's going to be the last time it works. We go back in to the loop, and here we have the 4 again. So we're going to reinitialize this. 3 plus 2 is 5. So a is actually starting at 5. So 5 is less than or equal to 3, or to 8. We go down, we increment, so a becomes 6. And then we print x. And remember, we're printing x because these have quotation marks. That's the key thing. We end the inner loop, go back up, increments to 7. 7 is less than or equal to 8. We go into the loop. We now increment to 8, we print an X, which is the next line down, and then end of inner loop. So go up to increment here, and A is now 9. 9 is not less than or equal to 8, so now we get to end the loop. Go to the system.out to println, go to the next line down, end of outer loop, and then we go here and increment X. X becomes 4, which makes the test false. So we kick out of the outer for loop, and we're done.